All right, welcome. Let's get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Eric Viam. I chair the SLO Climate Coalition. This is an event that is hosted by Uniting the Central Coast for Action, which is a collaboration of stakeholders from across the Central Coast advancing climate leadership within our region. Let me just give you a little orientation to the event today. You can see that the meeting is being recorded. We will share the link with anyone that's interested. We'll share it with the list. We ask that questions that you have, that you please enter those questions into the chat. We also have two links for you, and I'll share those in the chat right now. One moment. So the first link I just shared is actually a link to this presentation, which you're allowed to view in view mode. And I just want to, through that link, you'll be able to just look ahead at the conversation and the questions that we're going to be asking together in discussion with our special guests. And then also just want to show you, there's some reference material lower in the presentation that includes information about the vision that we as Uniting the Central Coast for Action have been creating around our climate leadership and our regional community choice program. So you have access to that information. And then the second link I want to share with you in the chat is a pretty cool tool called the Easy Retro, an Easy Retro tool. And so I encourage you all to jump onto that tool through that link. And what it is a collaborative platform that includes a couple important pieces. One is a survey for you to take so that we can kind of measure the level of the audience and speak accordingly to that level. And then a great place for us to capture, add ideas, issues and challenges, professional contacts if we haven't met before, so that we can be in touch, any research reports and articles, and then other resources. And so it's really easy to use. You just click the plus button, you type in the information, and you press the check mark, and it'll be added. You can vote it up, and you can also add comments. And so throughout the event today, we encourage you to capture salient ideas that you heard, to share your information, and to help build a catalog of resources that we can use to advance the conversation. The topic for today is distributed energy resources. And many of you may be aware that there is an active conversation happening around distributed and local energy resources nationally and internationally. And the conversation looks like the balance of how much of our resources should come from utility scale and how much should come from distributed energy resources, and how do we value those things. We're excited and aware of the possibility that Central Coast Community Energy, through our advocacy, is in the process of considering a distributed energy resource policy for the community choice program. And we, as Uniting the Central Coast for Action, are helping to facilitate a broad community discussion to explore the dimensions of distributed energy resources, and to help inform that policymaking process. So coming back here, we are very lucky to be joined by two statewide and beyond experts in the topic of distributed energy resources. Our first guest is Bill Powers. Bill Powers is a mechanical engineer with decades of experience. He is the principal at Powers Engineering, is the author of San Diego's roadmap to 100% local solar by 2030, and has made numerous testimonies at the Public Utilities Commission. He also serves on the board of Protect Our Community Foundation. We're also joined by Lorenzo Kristov, who's the former CAISO, and CAISO is our state grid operator, the CAISO Market and Infrastructure Policy Group. And Lorenzo, you can access his LinkedIn He has a very long, distinguished career in this area. He also makes significant contributions to the Public Utilities Commission and FERC through his testimony, and he is currently in a role consulting for a statewide community organization called the Climate Center on an important piece of legislation, SB 99, which would help to facilitate and fund community energy resilience planning. So the way that things are going to go today, and let me just step back to our agenda, is we're going to have a facilitated discussion with our guests based off of the questions that are included in the presentation, and I'll post those links for folks that might have joined late. And then we encourage you to post any questions within the chat, and then in the time remaining, we'll be able to answer those questions, and then we'll wrap up with any closing remarks and next actions. So without further ado, let's get right into our conversation. Again, I'm posting those the access to the presentation and the easy retro tool. And let me unshare and spotlight our guests. All right. All right, can everyone see Lorenzo and Bill Powers? Wonderful. Great, thank you for joining us. Let's begin with a question. As we're pursuing the development of a distributed energy resource policy for our Central Coast region, what principles do you suggest we use to guide the policy for distributed energy resources? And can you share some examples of how DERs achieve the proposed principles? And Mr. Kristov, thank you for joining us. I'll start and send that question to you first.
Okay, thanks, Eric, for the introduction and the invitation to be here. Glad to be talking with you all. Distributed resources is something I've been thinking about for a long time, like way back to the early 2010s when I was still working at CAISO and starting to realize that distributed resources were going to be a major phenomenon that changes just about everything about how the power industry works, from operations to business models to regulation and so on. And I think there's a couple of things I want to mention just about the larger landscape of how the power sector is changing and the importance of distributed resources, things which I don't think have completely sunk in yet at the policy level. One of them is that the proliferation of DERs, I believe, is inevitable. That the costs keep coming down, their capabilities, their performance capabilities keep getting better. The grid keeps getting more expensive. For 100 years, if you wanted electricity, you had to get it from the grid, except for things like flashlight batteries and car batteries. But mostly, the grid was the only place to get electric service of any significant volume and duration. So now that's not true anymore because any customer type can install on-site equipment. And so for the first time in 100 years, we have really viable competition for grid service. And I don't think that's sunk in because most of the thinking is still around seeing the grid as a monopoly, that's the only place to get power. And most of the thinking at the policy level is about strengthening or preserving that monopoly. I think ultimately that's a futile cause because we're seeing already that customers with the financial capability are putting on-site equipment, whether it's people with 14,000 square foot mansions that have said in some of the print interviews that they don't care about return on investment, they care about reliable, stable power quality, et cetera. To industrial customers, I read something a couple of weeks ago about Chick-fil-A restaurants opening, doing microgrid pilots in California. and pitching them as community centers to take in people when the grid goes down. So I think there's an unstoppable wave happening. Therefore, if that is an unstoppable wave, a crucial question, I think, for CCAs in particular, but for people involved in industry transformation and policy, is how are the benefits and burdens of distributed resources going to be distributed? Who's going to benefit the most from them? Who's going to be left out of the benefits? And who maybe bear some of the burdens and challenges that they create. So far, they've been framed as a challenge for grid operations. And there's no question that they do challenge the conventional ways of grid operations. Similarly, they're framed as a challenge to utility revenue models. And that's also an issue that needs to be addressed. So I'm not dismissing those. But what is missing largely is the huge potential benefits that DERs can provide. And I think that's really been underestimated. So I would start with, as a principle, who's going to benefit from DERs and what can CCAs do about that? And I think that's really an important consideration. We saw, if any of you were following AB 1139 in the last legislative session, there was a lot of action in response to that bill, which was going to limit, if not undermine completely, net energy metering, and made a strong equity argument that rooftop solar only benefits wealthy people, and therefore we should squash it. And I believe that's a totally bogus argument, because it's really turning the equity question upside down. What we should be doing is figuring out ways that more low and middle income and marginalized communities can benefit from distributed resources, rather than trying to prohibit them. So that's one starting principle I would go to. Another is has to do with fully realizing the performance capabilities of distributed resources. And here's also where I think CCAs can play an important role. That if you just view them as a problem, then of course you've got to invest in a lot of grid infrastructure, which the utilities like, because they make their grid stronger and they get a return on investment. But there's huge potential benefit in flattening load profiles. Everybody knows about the famous duck curve that's plagued the California ISO. It's been around in the literature and in the presentations for 8 or 9 years already. We've seen it coming. It keeps getting worse. And what many people don't realize is that the shape of the duck curve, which is created largely by all the solar production, which is very high in the middle of the day and then tapers off in late afternoon, early evening, and then there's a steep ramp as air conditioning loads keep going up. That's the problematic operational aspects of the duck curve. But that big belly of the duck, all that solar production, something like 40% of it comes from rooftop solar. So in California, there's almost 10, or in the ISO footprint, there's almost 10,000 megawatts of rooftop solar, and there's about 12 or 13,000 megawatts of utility scale solar that's contributing to the duck curve. If you could flatten out the solar production profiles at distribution level, whether it's at an individual building or more likely at an individual distribution circuit, then all of that contribution to the duck curve doesn't go up to the ISO. It's all managed locally. Now, there's value to that. There's value in avoiding infrastructure investment. There's value in avoiding operational costs, like the costs of reserves and the potential for grid excursions that can affect reliability. But we don't yet have a regulatory framework that actually recognizes that value and quantifies it and puts rules in place to compensate it. Another aspect of the value of DERs one of the things that we hear throughout the country, and I'm involved in a lot of the other ISOs and RTOs in a couple of projects right now, because FERC Order 2222 requires that all the RTOs allow distributed energy resource aggregations to participate in the wholesale markets. And all the ISOs and RTOs are struggling with how to figure that out. And as a result, what I hear from a lot of the developers of distributed resources is they really need the earnings of resource adequacy capacity. In California, we don't have a capacity market, but we have capacity requirements, and CCAs, I think one of the challenges for them in general is meeting the RA capacity requirements. That's an important part of their costs. And the rules for RA eligibility are very difficult for distributed resources, especially behind the meter resources. There are no rules to give them resource adequacy eligibility. Some of you may have listened last week. The ISO had a meeting about deliverability, and deliverability is a criterion in order for a resource to get resource adequacy capacity credit. That's a huge challenge for small resources on the distribution system to get deliverability. So what an innovative idea that I heard from MCE that I think is something that all CCAs might want to think about is they've grown frustrated with trying to get resource adequacy capacity credit. What they can do instead with distributed resource is reduce their RA capacity requirements. The requirements are based on their peak load or their share of the system coincident peak load. And that's an annual number that determines how much RA capacity they need to acquire. If they can flatten out their load profiles, then they reduce their RA requirements. And so there can be a direct financial benefit to the CCA for doing that. The program I heard described by MCE was to subsidize batteries behind the meter at customer sites where they have rooftop solar and allow MCE to have, through a DERMS kind of system, control over those batteries to flatten their load profiles. So by flattening the aggregate CCA load profile, they can reduce their RA requirement. It's a financial benefit to them, but it's also a resilience benefit for all the customers that get the batteries, and they could also install some of them on municipal facilities or community centers, so they provide a resilience benefit to the rest of the community. In addition, and again, this is not something that's monetized yet, but if MCE can control batteries to moderate their own aggregate load profile, they could also control them to flatten profiles on individual distribution circuits and provide an avoided cost benefit there to the distribution utilities. This really needs development through the PUC, and this upcoming OIR that they're doing, that they've just opened on distributed resources, I think is a place to start advancing some of these ideas. But I think, just to start thinking about how might we implement local resources that can provide financial benefits to the CCA and also provide resilience benefits to local communities and customers. I think there's a lot of good ideas brewing. So I will stop there and pass it on to back to Eric or to Bill.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Lorenzo. Just want to remind folks that to please go ahead and access the Easy Retro tool. The link is in the chat, and that's going to be a great place. There's already some activity capturing some of the important insights from this conversation. So I'll pass it over to you, Bill. Please take the same question. What principles do you suggest we use to guide policy for DER, to guide a DER policy?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Lorenzo, for your comments. And I want to echo what Lorenzo said out the gate, which is I see the proliferation of DERs as inevitable too. And what takes up much of my time is trying to avoid billions of dollars spent on unnecessary infrastructure between now and getting to that inevitable endpoint. And the little bit of my background, power systems, consulting engineer, but I was really impacted by the 2000-2001 energy crisis. And one of my responses to that was to put solar and batteries on my house. I think that was the first one of its type in San Diego, but I've seen over the last 20 years how, especially for reliability, that system is so effective and so inevitable once the prices come down. And I was an expert witness 13 or 14 years ago in a big transmission power line case, the 500 kV Sunrise Power Line. And my testimony was that we could do this cheaper, better, faster, even now, and now happen to be 2008 with DERs. And it's only gotten more pronounced. But at the same time, when this question is, what principles do you suggest? Can you share some examples? Well, about that same time, 2008, with significant IOU resistance, we developed the California Energy Efficiency Strategic Plan that called for all new construction residential by 2020 to incorporate solar, which we now see happening. You look around your communities, new construction has solar on it. Called for 25% of existing residential to have not quite be 100% zero net energy, but close. It called for 50% of existing commercial to be zero net energy by 2030. So in the context of that plan, the principle was go for broke, get solar on existing construction and new construction. And so that I have advocated since that plan was developed that we have a blueprint, and it's a great blueprint, and we need to follow it. And I had mentioned going back in time to the Sunrise Power Link, but I'm a witness in this net metering 3.0 proceeding at the commission right now. And in that proceeding, I'm pointing out that one of the outstanding benefits of DERs that they are not being credited for is backing down on new transmission, on distribution expansion, and that ultimately the vision for me is that this inevitability happens, we maintain the grid, we keep it operational so that we can do what Lorenzo was saying, is we aggregate DERs and we have virtual power plants and we maximize the values of those. But the paradigm has to shift into the grid T&D being more of a maintenance operation than where we're putting all of our resources. But I think I'll leave it at that as far as what we're battling on right now at the commission. Last point is, and Lorenzo, I'm sure you're aware of this, where the ISO made a pretty big pronouncement 3 years ago about eliminating a lot of transmission in PG&E territory, specifically citing the unexpected growth of NEM solar as a reason, and spending a couple of years since then walking it back and saying we can't quantify what that is. But fundamentally, if you're producing power at the point of use, you're not going to be needing to increase the size of the transmission system. Final point on the PCIA charge is the utility is, or the investor in utilities continue to fight some pretty effective rearguard actions like this exit fee charge for CCAs. And that complicates maximizing DERs, but I'll leave it at that for now because I'm sure we'll get into this a little more later.
Great, thank you, Bill. Okay, so our next question is, what are the unaccounted for values of DER, and how do we bring them into the equation to better inform policy and financial decisions? And whoever is called to go first, you're welcome.
Well, I would start with how I think about the bigger goals for the power system, looking at the 2020s and beyond and where we're at with climate disruption. I see the big three as decarbonization of electric power and electrification of lots of other things. That's a long-term project that's going to unfold over many, many years, but starts yesterday. And then there's resilience, which is really short term. It's really aimed at how do we survive the impacts of the climate disruption that's already happened. And even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, we will still see a couple of decades of impacts of things that have happened in the past, with the melting polar regions and release of methane and rising sea level and toxicity of various forms that have been created by the energy industry. So short-term resilience, how do we deal with that? And the third being equity or environmental justice. These are things that California has talked a lot about, and many other places do as well, as being objectives for the 21st century that go beyond whatever we expected from the power system for the last 100 years. Those three, decarbonization, resilience, equity, were not really part of the conversation. So these are the new things. Now, a lot of people are making the case that we can achieve the decarbonization simply by building up the bulk power system, invest a lot in transmission, get wind and solar resources from states that have plenty of these natural resources but don't have a lot of load, move it around the West or move it around the country, and then serve customers at the end. And that argument will probably continue for a while. It's unfortunate that it's polarized, but that's the way it is. However, when we get to resilience and environmental justice, I don't think those are things that the bulk system can provide. Resilience, to me, and we see it framed a lot in the conversation with the prefix grid resilience. So that almost frames the whole conversation in how do we make the grid stronger, which then points to investment in utility infrastructure. I prefer to reframe that as service resilience from the perspective of the end user or the end use application. What's the resilience of electric service, which in my opinion, needs to go beyond the resilience of the grid and prepare for a situation where grid service goes out. I believe that no matter how many gazillions of dollars we invest in strengthening the grid, there will be times when it fails. And when it fails, people will suffer and die, and all sorts of things, all sorts of adverse impacts will occur. And we can't be 100% dependent on the grid. To me, that's the big lesson from Texas. 200 people either froze to death or asphyxiated trying to avoid freezing to death because when their power went out, they had no place to go. We should be building resilient community centers and shelters in every community in the state and have places for people to go when their power goes out. Have facilities that can provide continuous service when grid service is disrupted. That's something that the bulk system can't provide because it doesn't provide for what to do when it's not there. And so that's something where I think CCAs can also take a lead, because they can be the project sponsors in a way that help to identify, because they are in touch with their communities, what are the high priority local facilities that ought to be protected, that can provide shelter for people when their power goes out, that can provide cooling when it's 115 degrees outside, or that can provide heat when it gets really cold, and take people in when the grid goes down. So I think this resilience value is something that's really under-recognized in the policy world, because they keep thinking in terms of making the grid stronger. Similarly, environmental justice or equity, I think, is going to have a strong economic benefits component to it, or needs to have an economic benefits component. That is, a lot of the things that marginalized and disadvantaged communities experience come about just because they don't have funding to invest in things that are basic needs, like access to healthcare and mobility services and energy efficiency upgrades to weatherize homes and that sort of thing. So distributed resources combined with local ownership models, whether it's municipally owned or owned by a community-based organization that forms a co-op, the residents in a particular area, neighborhood power systems like the Eco Block project in Oakland, we can be replicating these types of things that as they produce electric services, they generate revenues that stay in the community instead of being siphoned off to go to big investors and Wall Street banks. The opportunity of DERs is not just decentralizing the physical assets, it's also decentralizing the ownership. So I would say these two values require a broad constituency to start arguing for them. And I think CCAs can play a really pivotal role.
Great, thank you, Lorenzo. Bill, can I pass that question over to you?
Sure. And I don't want to sound like a cheering section, but I like what Lorenzo is saying. I really do. That sounds great.
Great,
And
thank you.
I think what I'll do is use an example, which, what are the unaccounted for values of DER? And since I'm down in San Diego and we were ground zero for these catastrophic fires about 15 years ago, and which were all initiated by or caused by the utility. And that subsequently resulted in SDG&E putting forward a number of mitigation projects. And frankly, my experience doing this now for 20 years is it's a form of disaster capitalism where you blow up San Bruno or you create mega fires. And instead of anyone ending up in an orange jumpsuit, the utility gets a $2 or $4 billion build-out program to do what should have been happening before those disasters occurred. So that's just a op-ed commentary on my part. So with that background on San Diego, unfortunately, San Diego has been put forward, San Diego Gas and Electric, as the model for dealing with wildfire mitigation. And for 10 or 12 years down here, since the smoke was still clearing, I have been advocating, you've only got 30,000 customers in that extreme fire area. If all 30,000 of them are equipped with enough solar and battery storage that they can take care of themselves when you need to shut off the power, if and when you do, then you can shut off that power whenever you need to do it. And it's not going to inconvenience your customers, and it's not going to put medical baseline customers at risk. And that's the way to go. And if it's NEM solar, the customers or some third party is going to own it. This is not rate-based money that's going to go back on other customers. So that's been the debate down here for 10 or 12 years. We have not carried the day. And currently we have an extraordinarily expensive undergrounding program underway where the utility is spending over $3 million a mile to underground distribution lines that serve on average 20 customers. You do the math. That's $150,000 of capital per customer on average for this program. And I've done the math too. If you had them on, if we were to go a different way where they're covered with solar and battery storage, the value of that solar and battery storage per customer compared to that undergrounding program would be about $15,000 per year of value. And I'm using this as an extreme example of the value that net metered solar and battery storage can provide. And currently combined, the three IOUs are projecting are going to spend approximately $40 billion on wildfire mitigation. And now it's a statewide issue. I mean, they are doing power shutoffs pretty indiscriminately around the state. And given the condition of their system, that may not be such a bad idea, but what is not legitimate and which really violates the obligation to serve is not providing those customers that are being shut off with a tool to assure that they have power at the worst possible time, which is a fire hazard condition where they're exposed and they need that power. And so I say that as an example of unaccounted for value, because $40 billion is a lot of money. And the number of customers that are in these extreme fire areas throughout the three IOU territories. And I think SCE may be cooking the books a little in that, we've got about 30,000 here. PG&E's got about under 200,000. I would expect SCE should be in that same category, but I think they've put some entire towns into this category. But leaving that aside, that's 600,000 or 700,000 customers. We could cover them with solar and batteries in a few years. If we made it a priority, we could do it in the same opt-out format that the IOUs have developed for rolling out their TOU programs. But that value from that set of customers would completely eliminate and by far shift the value of DERs generally, not just those that are in extreme fire areas, in favor of net meter customers, meaning we would be so far shifted as a benefit to all the other customers that it would not even be debatable. And so that's just one, it's an extreme case that has become mainstream in California, which is we're far more vulnerable to wildfire mitigation shutoffs than we are to rolling blackouts. We had some rolling blackouts last summer. They were short duration. They never should have happened, but that's not the biggest threat. The biggest threat is almost capricious blackouts of large areas of the state for extended and uncertain periods of time, which cry out for those customers that could be subject to that to be equipped ASAP with solar and battery storage. So the utilities can cut that power when they need to, and it doesn't inconvenience their customer base.
Great, Bill. You know, just to kind of summarize what I heard from Lorenzo, these, you know, I just consider them values, principles of decarbonization, resilience, and equity. I see those as driving resilience being defined from a place of a service resilience. I think that was a big takeaway from those comments. And then from Bill, just to think about the wildfire mitigation, $40 billion of work that's being done on the grid instead of within the communities, you know, benefiting directly and helping to transition in the way Lorenzo was describing to alternative ownership models. It's just from my view, a huge missed opportunity
Right.
that hasn't those resources haven't been dedicated yet. There's still time for us to make a difference there. So okay, we've got about 6 to 10 minutes here. I'd love to jump into the next question. What opportunities are you seeing to leverage DERs to create value for communities and their CCA? And do you have any examples? And I know Lorenzo has already given a bit of background. Just touch on that again. But what opportunities do you see to leverage DERs for benefit of communities and our CCA? Lorenzo, you want to jump in?
I would certainly give Bill the opportunity to speak first this time, since I've been the one jumping in ahead. Bill, if you want to answer on that question.
Sure. Thank you, Lorenzo. I can be brief on this. Eric did mention that I put together a roadmap to 100% solar in San Diego for 2030. We're already close at our base is about 45–50% with utility remote solar and wind. So it's basically getting the next 50% locally and trying to balance the challenges of the PCIA exit fee and the impact, the perverse impact it has on CCAs when they try and go full bore on NEM systems. And one opportunity I see that still works is doing a lot of non-residential solar in urban areas in front of the meter, and doing it, selling that into the system just as it were any other solar system, but it's on mall parking lots, public facility parking lots, and rooftops, and taking full advantage of that until we get the politics right and we get an exit fee that isn't so punitive to net metered systems and taking kilowatt hours off the grid. But that can be done. And I know I'm a little bit out in front of this, but my feeling is that those projects, if they're done right, and this is where CCAs have some power, which is they have full-time employees that can bird dog the projects, they can work the permits, they can maximize public facilities so that there's no payment or lease payment to private parties. They can set them up in bundled formats where you're going out to bid for 10 or 20 megawatts at once, so that you can get a price point of 4 cents a kilowatt hour, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, have solar, have batteries, and work the low hanging fruit, which is what I see that is, and that you're not constrained by exit fees and able to go to scale on that. So I see that as one excellent opportunity in this current CCA political environment.
And just to clarify, Bill, that's for the front of the meter commercial systems, that would be solar and storage.
That's what I'm advocating. I think that storage is so valuable, and I'm confident that we're going to get that aggregated dispatch into the wholesale markets. We're going to get that right soon, because there's a tremendous amount of pressure to make that operational.
Great, Lorenzo.
Yeah, and I would also echo storage combined with solar. I think the days of just promoting naked solar are really at a limit, because if we just put on more solar without the ability to manage it through storage, through absorbing that excess during the day, that's going to drive infrastructure. What we want to do is avoid infrastructure. And for that, we need this controllability that you get by combining it with storage. So I think that's essential. I agree with Bill's model about having front of the meter facilities at community level or at local government level or industry level, whatever is the suitable entity to put that equipment on. A continuing challenge, though, is still getting resource adequacy credit for those. And that comes down to the deliverability rules at the ISO, which are a hurdle, or the WDAT interconnection process, which is another hurdle. So it's not, while the pathway to earn revenues through the ISO spot markets, that is energy and ancillary services, I think that pathway is pretty straightforward. But in order to make a project pencil, you do need to get the resource adequacy revenues. And the problem that we have there is that resource adequacy, the definition of it is archaic. So one of the areas where I think some significant policy effort is needed is in redefining resource adequacy for a more distributed resource future. Right now, the mentality of the industry, which includes the utilities and the PUC, but it's really the industry at large, has been centralized top-down control. So when it comes to DERs, and if any of you listened to the ISO presentation last week about deliverability, becomes really obvious. You have distributed resources, and the rules are based on an assumption that when a distribution connected solar farm puts energy into the grid, that energy is delivered to the ISO. And then all the end use load is served by the ISO. Well, that's a fiction, a regulatory fiction that doesn't align with the laws of physics. And one of the things we learned from the original ISO and power exchange design from the late 90s that was involved in the big crash in 2000 was that we had a market structure that allowed transactions that didn't make sense in terms of the laws of physics. We know from the way the laws of physics apply to electric systems that energy injected by a distributed resource is going to follow the path of least resistance and serve local load. So what the ISO sees is a reduction in net load. They don't see energy being delivered to them and then them delivering energy back out. So we need a resource adequacy paradigm that recognizes that physical reality. In other words, can we build local resources and set them off against local load rather than pretending to deliver them to the wholesale market and then buy them back out of the wholesale market? I don't know that that conversation is happening anywhere, even though there is a PUC RA proceeding that's looking at more near-term fixes to RA. I think we need to ultimately go in this direction of aiming towards local resources that serve local load and offset wholesale market requirements. I think CCAs can be important pioneers in that area, but it also, what I'd like to see is a greater collaboration across all the CCAs to start figuring out and promoting a 21st century resource adequacy paradigm that's not based on this coincidence system peak and planning reserve margin and stacking up capacity, because that's really an archaic idea that doesn't work. I realize I'm maybe a little bit off topic of your question, but I think that's an important thing to think about. That's one of the key stumbling blocks right now.
Okay, great. Well, I think that we covered a lot there, both in terms of opportunity and some of the barriers. I think there has been a pattern of barriers. Like, we're in the process of working through some of these big questions, like as we speak, and it's a highly dynamic environment that we're in. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to kind of see those challenges and shape the outcomes in a way that serves our communities. So we just have about 5 or so minutes left. I want to ask a couple questions, just great questions from the group. One second here. Oh, this question. So who is going to manage the DERs that are being put onto the grid? Can you speak briefly to what that might look like?
Well, one idea. Oh, go ahead,
Lorenzo.
Well, one idea is just the one I mentioned before that MCE is working on, that with behind the meter batteries, they can control them with an agreement with the customers and use it to flatten their load profiles. For a case of a microgrid, third-party microgrid controllers are available and can be implemented. The idea that the PUC is asking in this latest OIR is about something they call a DSO, which is a term that I introduced back in 2013 and got a bunch of raised eyebrows as to who let this guy in. But now everybody's talking about DSO models, and the idea is, how do we enhance the functioning of the distribution utility? So I think it's a combination of, number one, reforming the distribution utility so that we separate out all the competitive stuff like retail kilowatt hours and building vehicle charging stations, and just reduce them to a wires only monopoly where their function is to operate a reliable network. Then we can have third parties who are aggregators of distributed resources control those resources, and it'll be a coordination relationship between the DSO and the third party aggregators and operators that will work together. That's part of the coordination framework that FERC talks about quite a lot in a major section of Order 2222. These are technologies that lots of people are working on, these coordination frameworks, but it will be a coordinated thing, I think, that has to involve the wires company and then the third party aggregators.
Great. Bill, did you have anything to add on that? I got a question for you in a different direction too.
Yeah, not really. Just I agree that third-party aggregators can serve an important role. You know, the DSO concept is great, but there's a lot of politics to cut through to get that to be a fully operational issue without all of the follow the money issues related to the IOUs. And so, but I do like that third-party aggregator approach, and I'll leave it at that, Eric, since I know time is getting short.
Yeah, and Seth is asking a question. I'm trying to understand. It says, aren't some of the and this is for you, Bill, aren't some of the PSPS shutdowns focused on regional transmission that would need to stay on, moving existing remote utility scale generation to urban areas?
Let me see if I understand that question, that we would have to keep bulk transmission on to keep power flowing. As far as I know, there haven't been, and I mean that, as far as I know, there hasn't been any transmission shutdowns associated with PSPS events, that they tend to be the sub-transmission or distribution level shutdowns. And I would agree, we can't shut down the bulk power system unless we're planning to black out the entire state. But I'm not aware of that being a practice.
Yeah. So this, I think, is a really important question. It is, I'm just reading the question. It is my understanding that CCAs are not decoupled. Do you see this as a barrier to CCAs championing DERs? Right. And
Yes.
yeah, can you speak to what that means and ways that we might be able to shift that disincentive to DERs?
Are you directing a question to Lorenzo or myself?
To
You want to take it, Lorenzo, and then I'll follow?
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I mean, you're right that it's an awkward model. The CCA with the IOU's strong interest, it tends to be almost opposite the CCA's interest. And the this roadmap that I developed, I was looking for an avenue to keep local solar growing, even with this perverse ratchet on doing DERs. So what it really takes is CCA muscle collectively to push back, and this perverse ratchet, this exit fee, has got to go because it is a huge impediment to doing anything behind the meter. And the whole point of doing CCA for many of us was to do a lot behind the meter. California's energy efficiency strategic plan is all about maximizing behind the meter. So we have a major incoherence in our policy right now, and we need to get that squared away so we can maximize DERs.
Yeah, and I think another dimension of that worth discussing is that in terms of like our CCAs, their scope of service is the procurement of kilowatt hours and not the transmission and distribution of that power. And so the way that the system is structured, they have an incentive to protect their revenues effectively by selling kilowatt hours of power. And so anything that's happening on the demand side, like energy efficiency or departed load from microgrids or solar and storage, is actually reduces revenue, which can with a mindset that sees that as a threat to create a structural opposition to DERs. Any thoughts about that and ways that we might shift that dynamic?
Well, you're right, and that's an important observation, because the notion of collecting revenues on a volumetric basis based on selling kilowatt hours is not only an issue for the utilities, it's also an issue for the CCAs. It's also an issue for municipal utilities and co-ops. They're all struggling with that same thing, that even if they really feel a strong desire for the benefits of DERs to their customers, they still have to worry about, well, what happens to our revenue stream? How do we pay for our assets and our operations? So I think as we move towards a higher DER future, especially with behind the meter, and I don't have a complete answer to that question. I think we really need to rethink the whole revenue model for the key players, especially the monopoly utilities. How do they earn revenue as, say, a DSO that's a wires company, if it's not going to be just based on kilowatt hour sales? And the same thing for a CCA. Somehow we need to transition to a service model, which is, customers don't care about kilowatt hours. They care about the services that energy provides. Well, what's the service that the grid provides? Besides delivering kilowatt hours, what else does it do? And I think in this future DSO world that I'm imagining, end use customers are not just consuming from the grid, they're also participants in the grid. They're providing grid services, they're getting compensated for that. And the distribution wire system provides a network on which they can transact with the wholesale market, or they can transact with other customers. So it's really rethinking the system as a transactive network rather than simply a one-way kilowatt hour delivery system that it's been for 100 years. But that's going to take some work, and I don't have a ready-made answer for that. But we do need to go to the heart of it. That is the issue. What is the revenue model that keeps these actors sustainable financially?
Great. Well, we're quickly running out of time here. We've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to thank you both for coming and spending an hour of your time sharing your experience and insight into ways that we can advance this, the move towards distributed energy resources for resilience and equity and decarbonization, and the benefits of and to benefit our communities and the Central Coast. I'm going to remove you from the spotlight and shift to closing. So thank you both, Bill and Lorenzo, for all your work in that space. Okay, let me share the screen. One moment. All right, so just to wrap up with everyone, there's just a couple of opportunities we want to share with you. One is to, can you see, oh, let me make sure you can see it. Great. I'm trying to see all of your faces. Okay, so the first thing is that we want to just thank you all for coming and spending the hour with us to talk about distributed energy resources and how we might have them benefit our region and community. We want to invite you to be part of Uniting the Central Coast for Action. Again, a group of diverse stakeholders that are committed to delivering a vision of CCA that provides maximum benefit into our region and into our community. And this event is hosted by the technical working group of Uniting the Central Coast for Action, and there's opportunities for you to engage if you have technically minded and want to advance some of the work and understanding to support a robust discussion and around any policy or program for climate leadership at our regional community choice program and at jurisdictions across the region. And then we're looking towards a follow-on event to this based off of some of the feedback that we've received from Bill and from Lorenzo, to actually invite some of the professional staff who are doing really great work around distributed energy resources. Some of the professional staff from other CCAs and our CCA, we of course would be invited to participate, to hear some of the good work that they're doing across the state, so that they can inspire us about what's possible here on the Central Coast. So I want to thank you all again for spending time with us, and ask you to look forward to follow on of the video recording and the resources that we had together or that we've created together in the Easy Retro. Awesome. And look forward to the next time for us to speak together. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.